Good afternoon, everybody. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss the social movements that erupted during the World War I periods and continued throughout the 1920s. Social protests surged in Japan during the final years of the First World War and in its immediate aftermath. The protests included labor strikes, riots, and movements for equal rights for the outcasts and women. These actions drew on older tradition of protest and older concepts of moral economy. But they were also shaped by new ideas and practices. They were the results of Japanese engagement with global trends since the late 19th century. In this context, the World War I and its conclusion had a significant impact on social protests and the responses to it in Japan. Intellectuals debated the character and meaning of these upheavals and their relation to democracy and to the political order, while many politicians and elite bureaucrats shifted to a more accommodative approach to social and political challenges, which led to Daisho democracy, which I will discuss in the next lecture. Along with Japan's industrialization, the number of factory workers continued to increase, but their rights and welfare remained inadequately protected. Even the minimal factory law of 1911 was often violated and neglected, and labor disputes were on the rise. At first, workers acted in the tradition of the pre-industrial social protest, ranging from petitions and peaceful appeals to violent actions. Industrial workers, whose protests soared in numbers in the last years of World War I, had also been building a modest new tradition of strikes and union organizing for some decades. By the eve of the World War I, heavy industrial laborers in shipyards, arsenals, steelworks, and mines had learned to coordinate activities and carry out disputes effectively. They drew on ideas and tactics with recognizably pre-modern precedents. In the actions of workers at the Uraga Dock Company around the time of Russo-Japanese War, for example, a time-honored sense of obligation, or kiri in Japanese, drew workers together in their occasional protests. The term kiri, which can be roughly translated into Korean uri, or Chinese ili, or shin-i, represented a critical social value that had roots in the past. Tactics included petitioning and the selection of representatives. This use of a petition signed by all those in a workshop was very similar to the custom of village petition, which often was a prelude to a peasant protest in the Tokugawa times. New elements included leadership or support by men who in some cases had studied organizing strategies and tactics in Europe or the United States, and in some cases had spent some time abroad. The first sustained union organizing emerged just before the First World War, led by Suzuki Bunji, a university graduate and Christian social reformer. He modeled his organization on British institutions of worker self-help called friendly societies. He named his organization Suiheisha. Literally, it meant friendly society. Suzuki's organization grew from a group of 13 men meeting in a Tokyo church basement in late 1912 to a union of 20,000 by 1917, with branches in factories and mines nationwide. From 1913, women were accepted as auxiliary members. They were offered full membership in 1917 when they numbered 1,500. Through 1917, the group disavowed striking as a tactic. Instead, it promoted self-help and self-improvement, and peacefully sought the cooperation of factory owners and managers to improve their working conditions. As I said in my introduction, World War had impact on social movements. In contrast to the utter disaster it brought upon Europe, World War I offered opportunities to Japan. The Great War cut European traders off from Asian customers, giving a huge boost to Japan's newly industrializing economy. Between 1914 and 1918, Japan's industrial output rose from 1.4 billion to 6.5 billion yen. Exports surged. Overseas sales of Japanese cotton cloth rose 185% during these years. Industrial employment ballooned from 850,000 to 1.5 million. Major corporations recorded their highest profits ever. With laborers in scarce supply, wages rose sharply. Unfortunately, however, for workers and consumers, prices rose even faster. Japan experienced its worst inflationary surge in modern times. As we shall see, between 1914 and 1920, the retail price of rice increased 174%, while wholesale prices overall rose almost 100%. So, the economic ground for social protest was fertile. Japan's political ground also began to shift during the war toward greater support for and greater expectation of more democratic politics. Just before the war, a movement for constitutional government promoted by members of the Diet in the Seiyukai party had forced the ruling oligarchs to concede cabinet positions and a measure of policy control to elected politicians. I will discuss these political developments in my next lecture. Anyway, in addition to the World War I, the success of a Russian Revolution in 1917 also influenced a labor movement in Japan. Actually, the Russian Revolution itself was a byproduct of the World War I. As you may know, It was the Germans that sent Vladimir Lenin back to Russia in a secret train to instigate a revolution. If you are interested in the subject, you are recommended to read the book To the Finland Station. Socialist ideas had already entered Japan early in the 20th century, winning modest support among young men and women. And some radically minded young men had joined the Outcastes while still students in 1914 and risen to leadership positions by 1917. They saw the Russian Revolution as an epochal global event, and it gave them impetus to transform the moderate, friendly society into a militant union. As a result, Japan's labor movement changed dramatically from 1917 through 1919 in the realms of ideas and actions. Until this time, as I said, despite the pressure from increasingly radical young activists, the Uitkai leaders disavowed strikes. They called for respect as members of the nation, or kokumin, rather than a separate class of workers. In 1917, however, actions at hundreds of production sites nationwide revealed that thousands of working men and women were no longer inclined to politely appeal for improved conditions. Before 1917, no more than 50 strikes were reported in any given year, involving no more than 10,000 participants in total. That count leaped to 398 strikes with 57,000 participants in 1917, and 417 strikes and 66,000 strikers in 1918, and 497 actions involving 63,000 men and women in 1919. Most of these actions took place in the machine industry, shipbuilding, and mines, where the workforce was mostly male. But a surge in protests also took place at textile mills, where most workers were young women living in a tightly monitored dormitories, expected to work only for a few years. Before 1917, no more than 14 strikes took place in spinning mills and weaving sheds, involving at the most 2,000 workers each year. From 1917 to 1919, textile factories witnessed more than 50 strikes each year, with a peak of 30,000 participants in 1918. In a clear response to the surge in wartime prices, 80% of strikes and more than 4/5 of strikers demanded wage increases. Smaller numbers of actions, about 5% each year, sought shorter working hours, opposed pay cuts, or sought redress from unfair supervisors. About 2/3 of the strikes either won all their demands or ended in compromise, most often a wage increase short of the full demand. This was a sharp turnaround from previous years, when fewer than half of strikes ended in full or partial gains. Through such experiences and the instigation of more radical younger leaders, the UIKI shed its skin as a moderate, friendly society. It began supporting the assertive labor unions already being organized in workplaces and federated by industry. In fall of 1919, the organization adopted a new name, the Friendly Society Greater Japan Federation of Labor. In 1921, it was abbreviated to simple Japan Federation of Labor. After the Great Earthquake of 1923, strikes again began to increase along with a swelling in the membership of unions. However, leadership struggles and cleavages continued to undermine and weaken the movement. In 1925, the communist-led unions broke away from the All Japan Federation of Labor and organized a separate organization, the Labor Council. In the meanwhile, the political authorities were becoming somewhat more flexible. In 1925, for example, the police regulation law was revised to eliminate the restrictions imposed on labor activities. At the same time, however, laws were adopted providing for compulsory arbitration in public enterprises and defense industries and control of violence in labor disputes. The strike wave of 1917 to 1919 was a clear sign of a major social change. But the most momentous social upheaval this period were the protests that have come to be called the Rice Riots that broke out in 1918. The riots inspired the labor movement toward greater militancy. To understand the background, we have to take a look at the Japanese economy of the time. The Japanese economy was undergoing a recession after the First World War broke out. And the situation worsened because the war initially reduced foreign trade. The price of rice and other grains continued to drop until mid-1916, when the trend was reversed. Japanese exports began to rise from the middle of 1915 as the belligerent nations were unable to supply goods to foreign markets. Japan sold war supplies as well as other necessities to the Allied nations, while at the same time increasing its exports to Southeast Asia and North and South Americas. In 1915, Japan's exports reached an unprecedented 708 million yen, and they continued to rise, reaching 1.96 billion yen in 1918. This resulted in tremendous economic expansion, increased circulation of currency, greater demand for goods, and inflationary prices. As is usually the case, the rapid increase in prices was not followed by higher wages. Consequently, real wages declined. Strikes, even though they were illegal, steadily increased in number, as we have already seen. Most seriously, the price of rice, which was and is the main staple grain in Japan, doubled between January 1917 and July 1918. This situation produced violent riots throughout the country in the summer of 1918. They began in late July 1918 in a small fishing village in Toyama Prefecture, with a protest led by wives in the fishing families. Protests rapidly spread to major cities, farming villages, and mining towns. By the end of September 1918, riots had taken place in 42 of 47 prefectures. Rallies protesting rice prices in major cities drew as many as 50,000 attendees and sometimes ended in riot. No comprehensive and precise account of events and participants is possible, but at the minimum, protests took place in 49 cities, 217 towns, and 231 villages, with upwards of 700,000 participants, and more likely over 1 billion. The response of the state to the rice riots was what Japanese idiom calls the candy and whip, or ameto muchi approach. The candy included large imperial and corporate donations to enable distribution of released rice, as well as the sale of rice at a discount to those judged needy by local officials. The whip ranged from state bans on public meetings and censorship of press reports of the riots to mobilization of military, police, and infantry. Police or troops killed more than 30 protesters around the country. They detained over 20,000 people and charged more than 8,000 with rioting or related offenses. Some of those arrested were brutally interrogated. In speedily concluded trials, most got off with fines, but 30 rioters received sentences of life imprisonment at hard labor. The Justice Ministry focused most attention on rooting out ideologically motivated rioters. By mid-September 1918, calm had returned to almost all the sites of protest. While the period of rioting was brief, the impact of the social protests of the final years of World War I was long-lasting. Prime Minister Terauchi Masatake resigned on September 19th of 1918. He was replaced by Hara Takashi, heading the Japan's first political party cabinet. It was the beginning of the party government known as Daisho democracy, which I will discuss in my next lecture. The efforts in the cities to organize factory workers were mirrored in the rural areas by similar attempts to organize tenant farmers. As I noted in my previous lecture, agrarian poverty resulted in a steady rise in tenancy. In 1917, 51.7% of the cultivated land was under tenancy, with the tenants paying an average of 51 to 55% of the harvest as a rent. Compared to a factory worker, a tenant's income was really beggarly. Disputes over rental rates began to increase after the recession of 1920, and the urban intellectuals and social workers moved into the countryside to organize the tenant farmers. In 1922, the All Japan Farmers Union was organized. The union called for mutual aid, love and friendship, rejection of violence, and the uplifting of peasants' lives. By 1926, there were more than 150 members in the union. The number of tenant disputes ran from 1,500 to 2,000 per year from 1921 to 1925. And it hit a high of over 2,700 in 1926. In many cases, the disputes were settled by compromise, but in some instances, the landlords got court orders to prevent the farmers from entering the fields held in tenancy. The landlords had the law on their side, so they created a situation in which it was almost impossible for the tenant unions to make much headway. Nevertheless, they succeeded in getting rents reduced to some extent. After the Manchurian Incident of 1931 and the upsurge of right-wing nationalism, the tenant movement completely collapsed. Despite the fact that legal discrimination against the Burakumin, or the social outcasts, had been abolished in 1871, social discrimination against these so-called outcasts continued. They still lived in separate communities, suffered discrimination in jobs, and were restricted to endogamous marriages. They could marry within their communities only. Another reform movement that emerged in the Taisho era was the effort made by the outcast leaders in 1922 to organize the Suiheisha, Levelers Society, for the purpose of pursuing their struggle for equality. They urged their fellow Burakumin to take pride in their heritage and fight for their dignity as well as economic and occupational freedom. Initially, the Suiheisha leaders encouraged their members to denounce and extract public apologies from anyone who in any way insulted or expressed contempt for the Burakumin. They hoped to eradicate social discrimination by taking aggressive actions against the individual wrongdoers. But not surprisingly, this approach tended to harden and internalize the resentment and disdain that the other classes felt toward them. Consequently, the Burakumin leaders decided that the social system itself had to be transformed, and they began to link their movement with the Marxist proletarian class struggle. Meiji Japan may have legally abolished the Tokugawa social class system, but it did little to change the status of women. They were still considered to be inferior beings, subject to the control of the patriarchal head of the family, before and after marriage, in custom and in law. Marriages were almost invariably arranged by the parents. Family property was inherited by the eldest son, with daughters seldom being given a share. The wife was treated as a minor by law. She could not enter into any contract without her husband's consent. Her property was placed at the disposal of her husband. She could be divorced easily without her husband being required to provide for her livelihood. And in the event of a divorce, the children were kept by the husband. Except for factory work, few women were employed in the business or professional fields. The employment of married women in particular was very uncommon, and even those who worked in factories were released upon marriage. Politically, women were not only denied the franchise, but also the 1890 police regulation law prohibited them from joining political parties and even forbade them from sponsoring or attending public political discussions. Female literary figures initiated the movement aimed at gaining recognition of rights for women. Among the leaders was Hiratsuka Raicho, who started a women's literary organization called Seito, or Blue Stocking Society, in 1911. The main purpose of this group was to discover and develop the hidden talent, particularly literary talent in women. It may not have sought the liberation of all women. Nevertheless, it constituted a pioneer effort in combating the ingrained customs that fettered Japanese women. The feminist leaders were willing to defy public opinion and challenge the conventional mores. As might be expected, members of the Seito Society were subject to hostile criticisms, and their journal, advocating equal rights for women, was suppressed by the authorities. These actions, however, only served to inflame the members. They began to defy the established mores all the more vehemently. Hiratsuka began to work for equal political rights for women around 1919. She had the assistance of Ichigawa Husae, who was active in the Yuaikai, and others in circulating a petition calling for the revision of police regulation law, which, as I said, prohibited women from engaging in political activities. They also asked for measures that would prevent men afflicted with venereal diseases from getting married. In 1920, the feminists organized the new Women's Association and asked not only for equal opportunities for women, but also for the protection of the rights of mothers and children. They sponsored numerous lecture series on a variety of subjects for the purpose of uplifting the political, social, and cultural awareness of women. Published a journal and agitated for universal suffrage. Their efforts did not produce much in the way of immediate results. In 1922, however, women were granted the right to sponsor and listen to political speeches, even though they were still prohibited from joining or organizing a political party. In 1924, the League for the Attainment of Women's Political Rights was organized, mainly by middle-class women. At the same time, a socialist women's organization, the Sekiran or Red Waves Society, was started by those who believed that discrimination against women was a byproduct of the capitalist system. In response to the social protests, the government basically resorted to the double-edged approach, which I briefly mentioned, throughout the 1920s. On the one hand, policies of accommodation were adopted with the help of the big business. In 1919, the Harmonization Society was founded, jointly funded by the state and major corporations. In the same year, the Ohara Institute for Social Research was founded by an industrialist concerned to address labor and other social issues. A social bureau was created in the Home Ministry in 1920. That was the first state agency with the explicit mission to resolve these newly prominent social questions: the labor, farmer, and women questions most prominently. As we have seen, however, labor unions and labor strikes continued apace, as did the founding of tenant unions and tenant protests, and the demands for universal suffrage for men and for women. The first May Day celebration in Japan took place in 1920, and an underground Communist Party was founded in 1922. The government granted universal manhood suffrage in 1925 and passed the Labor Dispute Arbitration Act and the Peasant Arbitration Act in 1926. On the other hand, harsh crackdowns also continued, particularly targeting those suspected of membership in the Japan Communist Party. A depression preceding the worldwide Great Depression struck Japan early in 1927 and dealt the labor movement a severe setback. Labor never recovered from this blow as Japan moved onto militarism, and the government tightened its control over all aspects of the society, including labor movements. Indicative of the changing tide were the two bills of 1931, would have granted legal protection to labor unions and tenant farmer unions. The Diet's House of Representatives passed the bills, but neither bill became law as the more conservative House of Peers rejected them. Thank you for your attention.